Welcome to Hidden Squidz Gaming. Today we're going to talk about Jacob Seed. Jacob Seed served in the U.S. Army as a marksman for the 82nd Airborne All-American Battalion. He is a veteran from the First Gulf War in Iraq, and he grew up protecting his younger brothers from their parents. He was hurt badly in the war, which you can tell from the imperfections to his skin, which are believed to be probably chemical related. His famous story from the Army is when he ate his friend Miller after not having enough food over 8 days, and this is where he learned his current ideology for life. The weak have their purpose, as he says. Joseph and John find him and have him become the trainer and the lead soldier for their cult. Jacob is the oldest brother out of the three. The premise of Jacob in his entirety, and he says it a million times, is to call the herd. What does this mean? Often is referred to animals and is a selective slaughter of animals from a larger selection. This fits his description and purpose perfectly, and if it didn't, obviously his areas would have massive story issues. It is Jacob's job to find the strong in the cult and to oust the weak. This means when people have purpose, they stay in, and once they don't, he will call them from the herd. This is his ideology, and this is his purpose.
History knows the value of sacrifice. Culling the herd so that it stays strong. Over and over.
Jacob does not speak a lot of words, and when he does, it's often about how we are soft as people and how long it takes for us to revert back to our animal instinct or our animal state. His longest insight into his life is the story with Miller. As mentioned before, Miller was a friend in the Army and they got separated from the rest of their squad. So they started walking back to the camp, and that was about 200 clicks away, also known as 200 kilometers or 125 miles, which is also almost the equivalent to 5 marathons. That's quite the distance, especially in desert terrain. On the way back, the 8th day hits and Jacob decides to eat him because Miller is seen as the weaker person. Thus he says, once again, the weak have their purpose. It is proposed that after this, Jacob is diagnosed with PTSD and is discharged from the Army.
Eat your muscles in order to survive. That's why you're so goddamn skinny. And by the 8th day, the wolves were closing in. And I looked at Miller and I could tell we were as good as dead. And I accepted that. And in that acceptance came clarity. You see, I wasn't just looking at Miller. I was looking at an opportunity. It wasn't something I wanted. It was something that I had to do. It was my test. You see, Miller's sacrifice wasn't about me walking out of that desert. It was about bringing me here. The weak have their purpose. You'll understand that soon enough.
Jacob takes classical conditioning and mixes it with a sense of survival of the fittest or Darwinism. If you wondered how he got you to the point of becoming a trained killer, let me explain real quick. I had questions about this as well. Jacob would starve most of his prisoners and subject them to images about becoming an animal or a killer. Most of the pictures are wolves and they are hunting or eating meat, meaning we must become ruthless and take down the weak. The first time you see the music box is when the slideshow is present. I would like to think, keeping on track with the other regions, that bliss was also used to help shape and mold the mind during these trainings. Thus, the combination of bliss, repetitive images, practice of killing, and being triggered by a song, you were becoming a trained killer Jacob needed. This is also classical conditioning in a nutshell. If you ever heard of Pavlov's dog, same theory. You train him that when he hears a song, he kills, so every time he hears a song, he just goes into a primal instinct to kill. That's why every time he plays a music box later in the game, you just start killing everything around you. As fascinating as classical conditioning is, it was only the method to carry out his overall ideology. In the first abduction theme, he mentions how humans and animals used to exist. The lives of the majority heavily outweighed the lives of the minority. This reasoning eliminates feelings and makes hard decisions be made quickly and ruthlessly. Animals in the wild have all types of defense mechanisms to fight off against Mother Nature and their natural predators. Some of the common examples of this are forming into larger groups or putting the more vulnerable prey in the middle of the pack. When creatures are alone or when they are found separated from the herd, often the herd of creatures will not go back and defend the one that's being attacked. Instead, the herd forms in a cluster, saving the lives of many rather than sacrificing more to rescue stragglers. This ensures the survival of the species, and this would technically keep the like-minded creatures alive with the group. This is seen as inherently beneficial since it would allow the creature's race to continue in the most optimal path possible. However, as Jacob says, our society has become weak due to our lack of natural predators, or our ability to fear about our race not continuing if we stop and take time to help out the weak and the lost.
Instincts in just 10 days. That's a difficult thing to understand unless you've lived it.
According to Jacob, when you are strong, you have purpose, but the moment you are weak, you are a liability and you need to be called from the herd. This is often the style of thought we see in post-war and post-apocalyptic movies and shows. It would suggest once we move towards survival and continuing our race, we tend to ignore the weak or put them lower on the chain of importance. Jacob is just merely exercising this school of thought and actions now to prepare for the collapse that Joseph predicts. Whether Jacob admits it or not, he's pretty much an elitist in that he wants the strongest to pass on and the weak to be called, all based on what he thinks is strong and what he thinks is weak. There's obviously ideas of Darwinism in there. However, it's more elitist in the end because it's coming down to him choosing rather than nature choosing.
You're alone. And you're weak. And we know what happens to the weak. I call the herd. It's what I do. I'll be outside waiting for you.
Regarding Jacob and his idea of Joseph, I would say it is unsure if Jacob does this to follow Joseph's plan or if Joseph simply enables him to act to his full capabilities. What do I mean by that? Jacob had already shown signs of literally eating the weak to live before Joseph and John asked him to be the trainer and the lead soldier of the cult. If it was not for those two, Jacob would still have this mindset, but the chances of him acting on the scale he was allowed to would not have happened.
2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Then he's got you. It becomes second nature routine. It gets in your head. And you don't even realize it. You can't ever go back.
He doubts Joseph's ability to speak with God, and Jacob doesn't really show fear or continually talk about the plan like Faith and John. He's extremely adamant about preparing people for the collapse. However, I believe this was Jacob's line of action before he was put into this position. I said this earlier, but listen to Jacob's words as he is dying. He mentions, I'm not sure if Joseph really hears God's voice. This is huge, because Jacob executed people despite not having complete faith in what Joseph was saying or doing this whole time. He has a come around in the end. He says everything he predicted is coming true, but the fact that you didn't have complete faith and that you are murdering all these people to go on a hunch that your brother might speak to God seems a little off. It seems like you're willing to go with this anyways. Jacob is the only character also to be actively suspicious about Joseph and his actions, except he is involved and consumed by his own ideas and doesn't really care.
America. We're no different. We think we're indestructible. World War II. War on terror. We survived it, but it only brought us closer to the edge. And this is where we are.
My brother Jacob was a fighter.
Finally, after Jacob's death, we get into the story about how Jacob was a fighter. He fought their parents. He fought the government. However, he also fought himself. What a powerful line. This game and the main idea is about people being broken and finding salvation in the Father. Whether that was what Joseph or what Joseph had planned for him, Jacob could not be seen to get over his past mistakes and trauma and turn himself into man about being for survival and existence.
Without a purpose.
Thus, in the end, he was called from the herd.
That he was a warrior without a legacy. But look around you. You are his legacy. All of you willing to protect our family from the collapse. To purge the sinful from our home. And you will, my children. You will purge the sinners from our home. Jacob's death will not be in vain.